The funeral was on August 8th, 1962, a Wednesday. The cemetery was called Westwood Village Memorial Park, which sounds like a place people choose for themselves, which she did not. Joe DiMaggio made most of the arrangements. He kept the guest list to 30 people. He did it deliberately. He said he didn't want the ones who had used her in life to use her in death. 30 people. For a woman whose face had been on the cover of Life magazine 11 times. For a woman who once sang Happy Birthday to the President of the United States in front of 15,000 people, in a dress so sheer it seemed less like fabric and more like the idea of fabric, while the whole country held its breath and the president stood grinning and flushed with something that wasn't quite pride. 30 people came to bury her. Most of Hollywood stayed home. That is the fact this story keeps coming back to. Not the dress, not the president, not the circumstances of her death in that small Brentwood house on 5th Helena Drive, which have been argued about for 60 years and will probably be argued about for 60 more. The fact that will not leave is the 30 people. Because if you trace the line from the girl who was born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926 to the woman who was buried as Marilyn Monroe in 1962, you find that the loneliness was not something that happened to her at the end. It was the organizing principle of her entire life. The fame didn't interrupt it. The fame made it worse. She spent her childhood being passed between families who didn't want her. Her mother, Gladys, was intermittently institutionalized with paranoid schizophrenia. Her father was a question mark she never resolved. The county placed her in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home when she was 9, not because she had no living relatives, but because the ones she had didn't want to take her in. She would remember standing at a window in that building and being able to see the RKO Pictures water tower from her room. Close enough to read the letters, close enough to understand that there was another world just there, across some distance that felt both small and absolute. The families who took her in on weekends and holidays, the foster placements before the orphanage and after it, she has described them in interviews with a careful neutrality that is more disturbing than anger would have been. She didn't hate them. She said she didn't hate them. She said she understood. That careful, measured understanding of people who failed her, repeated throughout her life in every relationship she ever formed, is one of the things that makes her story genuinely hard to sit with. She married at 16 to avoid another foster placement. His name was Jim Dougherty, a neighbor's son. He was 21 and kind and completely unsuited to her, though not in any dramatic way. He simply wasn't equipped for what she was going to become. And she wasn't equipped yet to know what that was. The marriage lasted 4 years. While he was overseas in the Merchant Marine during the war, she took a job at a defense plant in Van Nuys inspecting parachutes, which is where a photographer for the Army's 1st Motion Picture Unit found her in 1945 and asked if she wanted to pose for morale photographs. She said yes. The photographs circulated. A modeling agency signed her. The rest is a sequence of events that moved faster than she did. 20th Century Fox gave her a contract in 1946. She changed her name at the studio's suggestion. Norma Jean Mortensen became Marilyn Monroe. She had some input into the first name, Marilyn, which was a nod to the actress Marilyn Miller. The Monroe came from her maternal grandmother. The studio kept paying small amounts to maintain her contract and then declining to use her in anything substantial, which was a particular kind of humiliation she would learn to absorb. The same way she learned to absorb most humiliations, which was by not appearing to feel them. She took acting classes and singing lessons and studied the craft with a seriousness that people around her consistently underestimated because she was so distracting to look at. Her first real break was a small part in a Marx Brothers film called Love Happy in 1949, where Groucho Marx was given a line by the director to react to her entrance. And the line was so off-color that it had to be cut, but the fact that a director had done that, had recognized something that caused a professional comedian to actually respond rather than perform a response, was meaningful. She started getting noticed. She got a small part in All About Eve in 1950, playing a young actress at a party, a role with almost no lines where she appeared on screen for roughly 3 minutes and managed to draw every eye in those 3 minutes to herself and only herself. John Huston directed her in The Asphalt Jungle that same year and said afterward that she was one of the most naturally intuitive actors he had ever worked with, which was not a sentence anyone around her had expected him to say. The studio executives at Fox looked at all of this and decided she was primarily a commodity. They signed her to a new contract in 1951 and proceeded to put her in a series of films that used her face and her body and asked almost nothing of the intelligence she was quietly building. She made 7 films in 1952 alone. She was in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953, which made an enormous amount of money, and the studio's response was to put her in How to Marry a Millionaire 3 months later, and then River of No Return after that. They were manufacturing product. She was aware of this. She tolerated it, then she resisted it, and then the resistance became the most significant professional struggle of her life, which did not end in her favor, which almost never ends in anyone's favor when they are fighting a studio in the 1950s, and they are a woman. She married Joe DiMaggio in January 1954. He was the most celebrated baseball player in America, recently retired, a national figure of almost mythological proportion. The public adored the idea of them together. The marriage lasted 9 months. The specific event most often cited as the breaking point was a scene filmed in September 1954 over a subway grate on Lexington Avenue in New York for the 7-year itch, where gusts of air from below sent her white skirt flying upward and photographers captured the moment and the images went around the world. And DiMaggio, who was standing nearby watching, was observed by multiple witnesses to be enraged in a way that was cold and quiet and frightening. He had not married the image. The image had preceded her everywhere she went, and he had thought or hoped or told himself that there was a private woman separate from the public spectacle. And there was, but the public spectacle was inescapable, and he could not live inside it. She filed for divorce in October 1954, 9 months after the wedding. She told a reporter her marriage had been a failure and that she took full responsibility. She did not take full responsibility. She was being gracious in the particular way she was always gracious toward people who had hurt her, which was to distribute the fault until it became invisible. She left Fox in late 1954 and moved to New York. She had been studying with the Actors Studio there, with Lee Strasberg, and the New York period is the one her defenders point to when they want to establish that she was not what the studio had made her. She started Marilyn Monroe Productions with her photographer friend Milton Green, partly to control her own career, partly because she was genuinely interested in the material she wanted to make, and partly because she had decided, at some level, that the only way to stop being used was to own something. The company lasted 4 years before the relationship with Green collapsed, and Fox bought her back with a better contract and slightly better creative input, and then mostly went on using her the way they had before. She married Arthur Miller in June 1956. He was at the time under investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the marriage coincided with his congressional testimony. And she sat beside him during some of the proceedings, and the combination of her presence and his intellectual stature and the obvious political courage of the moment produced one of the stranger spectacles of that era, which was the country's most celebrated sex symbol sitting in a government hearing room while a playwright refused to name names. She converted to Judaism for the marriage. She took the conversion seriously. She read, she asked questions, she engaged with it as an intellectual and spiritual matter rather than as a gesture. Miller said later that he had never known anyone who so genuinely wanted to understand things, who brought so much honest curiosity to every subject she touched. He also wrote, in his autobiography, published 20 years after her death, that he had sometimes looked at her during their marriage and felt the distance between them and known he could not cross it, not because he didn't want to, but because something in her was unreachable. He thought it was sadness. He wasn't precise about it. The marriage ended in divorce in 1961, during the filming of The Misfits, which Miller wrote for her, and which turned into an extended document of a marriage falling apart in the Nevada desert, while John Huston directed everyone and Clark Gable tried not to die of the heat. Gable died 11 days after filming ended. Heart attack. There was a theory circulated by his widow and a few journalists that the physical demands of The Misfits, including several scenes where he insisted on doing his own stunt work, had contributed to his death. And a portion of the blame for the delays that had extended the filming was attributed to Monroe's absences and incapacitations on set. She heard this. She carried it. She had loved Gable in a specific way that was connected to the fact that she had grown up without a father, and had sometimes told friends, half seriously, that she used to imagine Clark Gable might be her father when she was a child looking at his photograph in foster homes. Whether that was literally true or something she constructed afterward doesn't really matter. What matters is that she felt it was true, and then he died. And she had some portion of the blame for that in her mind, however illogically, and she was not equipped to put it down. She was already in trouble by this point in ways that had been building for years. She had been dependent on barbiturates and other sedatives since the early 1950s, prescribed to her by a rotating cast of physicians who told themselves they were managing her anxiety. The anxiety was real. She had genuine insomnia, genuine panic, genuine difficulty functioning through the daily requirements of film production, which for her included the additional burden of being looked at constantly by 100 people on a set and knowing that every decision she made about her performance was being simultaneously evaluated for its artistic merit and its commercial viability. She took the drugs to sleep. She took them to function. She took them because they were there, and she had been told they were fine, and because no one in her life, with very few exceptions, had ever told her that something being available to her did not mean it was good for her. She entered the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York in February 1961, sent there by her psychiatrist at the time. She stayed 4 days before DiMaggio, with whom she had remained close after the divorce, and who was probably the most consistent presence in her adult life, came and removed her. She described those 4 days to friends afterward in terms that were quiet and precise and extremely disturbing. She said she had been placed in a room she could not leave and observed through a small window in the door, and that the observation had felt, to her, like a performance, without an audience that could respond, like being looked at by people who were looking for something specific and would only be satisfied when they found it, which was also a description of most of her working life. DiMaggio took her to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital instead. She spent 3 weeks there. Then she went back to Los Angeles. The performance at Madison Square Garden was in May 1962. It was a Democratic Party fundraiser for President Kennedy's birthday, a gala event at which dozens of performers were scheduled. She was the last act. She had been difficult to work with during the rehearsals or absent from them, and there was genuine uncertainty among the organizers about whether she would appear. She appeared. She was sewn into the dress by her costumier and helped to the stage by the theater's technical staff. Peter Lawford introduced her in a way that was intended to be funny, calling her the late Marilyn Monroe, in reference to her chronic lateness, and the audience laughed. And then she stepped to the microphone and sang "Happy Birthday" to the President of the United States in a voice that was doing something strange and considered and not entirely safe, stretching the syllables, making the ordinary words carry a weight of intimacy they were never designed to carry. And The 15,000 people in that room understood, whether or not they could have articulated it, that they were watching someone perform a version of herself that was very close to not being a performance at all. Kennedy stood at the podium afterward and said she had sung Happy Birthday in such a sweet, wholesome way and thanked her, and the crowd laughed again. He knew what he was doing. He was very good at knowing what he was doing in public. The nature of the relationship between Monroe and Kennedy has been documented and disputed for decades, with varying degrees of seriousness and varying amounts of actual evidence. What is documented is that after the party, at a private gathering at the home of Arthur Krim, she was present with the president and a number of other guests, and that this was the last time the two of them were in the same room. She was fired from Something's Got to Give by Fox in June 1962. She had missed most of the filming due to illness, both real and attributed. There were photographs taken of her on the set on the days she did appear. Photographs that showed her swimming naked in a pool and looking more genuinely at ease than she looked in almost any official image from this period of her life. And those photographs circulated and were used by some to argue she was not as ill as Fox claimed, which missed the point of the photographs entirely, which was that she was relaxed because no one was filming her in a way that required her to perform a specific thing. She gave an interview to Life magazine in late July 1962, one of her last, in which she talked about wanting to make good work and wanting to be taken seriously and wanting, in a word she used several times, to be real. The interview ran on August 3, 1962. She died on August 4th. The coroner listed the cause of death as acute barbiturate poisoning and the manner of death as probable suicide. The word probable has sustained an industry of alternative theories for 60 years. The toxicology was real. The circumstances of the evening have been argued about, reconstructed, revised, and argued about again. What is not disputed is that on the night of August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe took a fatal quantity of barbiturates in her bedroom in Brentwood, California, and that her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, discovered her body sometime after midnight and called Monroe's psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson, who came to the house and then called the police, though the timeline of those calls and the discrepancies between various accounts have never been fully resolved. She was 36 years old. DiMaggio arranged the funeral. He excluded the Hollywood crowd deliberately. Peter Lawford was turned away. Frank Sinatra was not invited. The studio executives did not come. Lee Strasberg gave the eulogy. He said she had a luminosity that was spiritual rather than physical, and that she had more than any other actress he had ever known the ability to make truth visible. 30 people stood in Westwood Village Memorial Park in August heat and listened to Lee Strasberg describe a woman he believed in, and then they buried her. DiMaggio sent roses to her crypt 3 times a week for 20 years. He never publicly explained the gesture and never remarried. When he was dying in 1999, his last reported words were that he would finally get to see Marilyn again. Whether that is literally what he said is not verifiable. It has been reported so many times that it has taken on the weight of the true, which is its own category of fact, the kind that persists because it needs to be true, because it completes something. The vault where she is interred is a plain white marble rectangle. It has her name on it, her birth year, her death year. For decades, someone left red roses in the vase beside it. Then the roses stopped. The vault is in a corridor of similar vaults, stacked 2 and 3 high, and people visit it every day. They leave lipstick prints on the marble. They leave photographs. They leave small notes that the cemetery staff collects and which no one reads. She is enormously visited and entirely alone in the way that famous dead people are always alone, which is a different kind of alone from what she was in life, but not entirely different. She told a reporter once, in the late 1950s, when the reporter asked her what she wanted people to say about her after she was gone, that she wanted them to say she had been good at her work. Just that. Not that she had been beautiful, not that she had been famous, not that she had been desired by powerful men, or worn a particular dress or sung a particular song. That she had been good at her work. She was good at her work. The 30 people at the funeral knew it. The rest of them came later.